In the crystalline spires of Zeria Prime, where time held no meaning and death was merely a distant legend, first scholar Nira stood before the Grand Archive's holographic display. Her silver eyes reflected the dancing lights of a newly discovered signal, a transmission from a species that by all measures should have been too primitive to reach across the stars. The Zerians had mastered immortality millennia ago, their bodies enhanced with biocrystalline structures that regenerated endlessly. They had created a perfect society, one where the concept of urgency had long since faded into obscurity. Why hurry when you had forever? Yet this signal, it pulsed with an energy that seemed almost desperate in its intensity. Naira found herself drawn to it, experiencing an emotion she hadn't felt in centuries: curiosity. Most peculiar, she whispered, her fingers trailing through the holographic representation. A species that burns so bright, yet lives so briefly. The data streaming across her vision told an impossible story. These humans, as they called themselves, lived mere fragments of a Zerian's first century. Their bodies were fragile, their lives fleeting. But in their brief existence, they had accomplished what took the Zerians millennia. They had reached for the stars with technology that should have been beyond their grasp, created art that stirred emotions the Zerians had long forgotten, and built societies that evolved at a pace that defied comprehension. The High Council chambers echoed with murmurs of disbelief as Naira presented her findings. The gathered immortals, their crystalline enhanced bodies gleaming with internal light, struggled to process the implications. They die, Elder Voss stated, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years. They simply cease to exist after less than a century. How can they achieve anything of worth? Naira activated another hologram, displaying human achievements across their brief history. That's precisely what makes them remarkable, Elder. They create, they build, they dream, all while knowing their time is finite. Perhaps, she hesitated, aware of the radical nature of her next words. Perhaps it is because of their mortality, not in spite of it. The chamber erupted in discourse. Some elders dismissed the humans as curiosities. Others warned of the danger their dynamic nature might pose to Zerian stability. But Naira noticed something else. Among the younger immortals, there were expressions of fascination, even longing. Second Scholar Theron, barely 1,000 years old, spoke up. Their art, it carries something ours has lacked for millennia. There's an urgency, a passion we've forgotten. When was the last time any of us created something truly new? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The Zerians had perfected their world ages ago, but in doing so, had they lost something essential? Their cities hadn't changed in 10,000 years. Their music remained the same harmonious compositions that had been deemed optimal. Their literature explored no new themes. As the debate raged on, Naira received a priority alert. The humans had detected their observations and were sending a direct message, an invitation for contact. The message was emotional, excited, filled with a warmth that felt almost foreign to their cold perfection. They wish to meet us, she announced, interrupting the council's deliberations. They speak of friendship, of sharing knowledge, of learning from each other. She paused, allowing her next words to carry their full weight. They know we are immortal, yet they believe they have something to teach us. As the council drafted their response, Naira couldn't shake the feeling that they stood on the precipice of profound change. The human signal continued to pulse through their networks, its rhythm like a heartbeat. Urgent, alive, finite yet powerful. Prepare the welcome protocols, Elder Voss commanded, but Naira noticed his hand trembling slightly. The first sign of uncertainty she'd seen in an elder in centuries. Let us see what these mortals believe they can teach the eternal. The arrogance of it should have been offensive. Instead, Naira found herself moved by their confidence, their unwavering belief that their brief lives held value even to beings who had lived for millennia. Elder Voss rose from his seat, his crystalline form catching the light. Then perhaps we should indulge them. If nothing else, it might prove instructive. His tone suggested he expected the humans to learn their own insignificance, but Naira wasn't so sure. That night, as Zuria's 3 moons cast their glow across the crystalline city, Naira stood in her private chamber, watching the distant stars. Somewhere out there, humans were looking back, their brief lives burning with an intensity her people had forgotten. For the first time in her long existence, she wondered if forever might be too long, if perhaps they had sacrificed something precious in their quest for immortality. The answer, she suspected, would come soon enough, and it would change everything. The arrival of the human delegation shattered the perfect silence of Zuria Prime. Their ship, a compact vessel that seemed almost primitive to Zurian sensibilities, descended through the crystalline spires with what the Immortals perceived as reckless haste. Leading the welcoming party, Naira noticed how the vessel's hull bore scorch marks and dents, signs of a journey that had been anything but perfect. Captain Raina Patel stepped off the ship with an infectious grin, her dark eyes drinking in the alien architecture with undisguised wonder. Behind her, a small team of human specialists emerged, each moving with an energy that seemed to ripple through the still air of the Zurian landing platform. "Your city," Raina breathed. "It's like diamonds caught in starlight." She turned to Naira, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Though I have to say, it's almost too perfect, like it's afraid to have a single flaw." The comment, delivered with warmth but striking at a truth the Zurians had never acknowledged, caused Naira to hesitate before accepting the handshake. The human skin was warm, imperfect, alive in a way that made Naira's crystalline enhanced flesh feel cold in comparison. "Perfection is stability," Elder Voss intoned from behind them, his ancient voice carrying the weight of unchanging millennia. "Why would one desire flaws?" Raina's science officer, Dr. Marcus Reed, stepped forward. His graying hair and lined face marked him as someone well into his brief lifespan. Yet his eyes sparkled with the energy of youth, because imperfection drives us to improve, to innovate. Perfect things don't grow, they just are. The human delegation was escorted to the Grand Archive, where the differences between the species became even more apparent. While the Zurians moved with measured grace, the humans darted from display to display, their questions tumbling out in an eager rush. They touched everything, their fingerprints marking the pristine surfaces, temporary blemishes that made the Immortals quietly uncomfortable. "Your technological advancement is remarkable," Theron observed, watching Dr. Reed examine a quantum computation matrix. "How do you achieve so much in such limited time?" Reed laughed, the sound echoing through halls that had known only whispers for centuries. "Limited time is exactly why we achieve so much. We can't afford to spend 1,000 years contemplating the perfect solution. We try, we fail, we learn, we improve, and yes, sometimes we break things in the process." As the day progressed, the humans' presence continued to disrupt the careful order of Zurian society. They requested food despite it not being a designated nutrition period. They suggested improvements to systems the Immortals had deemed optimal millennia ago. They told jokes, shared stories, and spoke of their families back on Earth with an emotional intensity that made some of the younger Zurians lean in closer, drawn to this display of raw feeling. During a formal exchange session, Raina shared images of Earth, cities that were chaotic but vibrant, natural landscapes both pristine and scarred, faces of humans experiencing every possible emotion. The Zurian Council watched in silence as she spoke of humanity's struggles and triumphs. "We've made countless mistakes," she admitted freely. "Wars, environmental disasters, social upheavals. But each time we fall, we get back up. We learn, we change, we grow." "But why risk failure?" Elder Voss challenged. "Why not simply achieve perfection and maintain it?" "Because perfection is stagnation," Raina replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Look at your magnificent city. When was the last time you built something new? When was the last time any of you dreamed of something different?" The question struck Naira like a physical blow. She looked around the Grand Archive, seeing it truly for the first time. Everything was exactly as it had been when she first took her position as first scholar, exactly as it had been for thousands of years before that. Later that evening, as the humans rested, another peculiarity the Zirians had to accommodate, Naira found Theron in the observation dome, watching Earth's distant sun among the sea of stars. "They're terrifying," he whispered. "All that emotion, that drive, that chaos. But I can't stop thinking about what they said. About growth and change. They burn so bright," Naira agreed, her voice thoughtful. "Perhaps too bright. And yet they make our eternal light seem dim in comparison." Theron finished. The next morning, the humans proposed something unprecedented. A cultural exchange program. They wanted to send teachers, artists, and scientists to live among the Zirians, and in return, they invited the Immortals to visit Earth. The council's chamber erupted in debate. The very idea seemed to challenge everything the Zirians had built their society upon. What could eternal beings learn from creatures whose lives were over in mere moments? But as Naira watched the humans passionately argue their case, she noticed something extraordinary. Several of the younger Zirians were nodding along, their usually perfect postures shifting with small, unconscious movements that mimicked human gestures. They were changing, ever so slightly, just from this brief contact. Perhaps she spoke into the debate, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. "That is precisely why we must accept. We have perfected existence, but they have perfected living." The words hung in the air, a challenge to millennia of certainty. In the silence that followed, Reyna smiled, a simple expression that somehow contained more life than all the crystalline spires of Zaria Prime. The Immortals stood at a crossroads, and for the first time in countless generations, the path forward was gloriously, terrifyingly uncertain. No one expected disaster to strike the perfect world of Zaria Prime. Yet when the ancient quantum core powering their central energy matrix began to destabilize, the Immortals found themselves facing something they hadn't encountered in millennia. A genuine crisis. The first tremors shook the crystalline spires during a human teaching session. Professor James Kumar had been explaining Earth's concept of music to a group of fascinated young Zirians when the floor beneath them shuddered. The Immortals froze, their perfect composure finally broken by confusion and mounting concern. "System failure detected in primary quantum core," the city's AI announced, its usual serene tone carrying an edge of urgency. "Cascade collapse imminent. Estimated time to critical failure, 6 hours." The Zirian Council gathered in their emergency chamber for the first time in 5,000 years. The humans, led by Reyna and Dr. Reed, insisted on attending. While the Immortals debated proper protocols and searched ancient records for precedent, the humans were already moving. 6 hours, Reed muttered, studying the holographic diagnostics. "That's not much time, but it's enough. Captain, permission to contact the Phoenix." Reyna nodded sharply. "Do it. Tell them to prep the quantum stabilization unit. We came here to learn from them." "Looks like they're going to learn from us first." Elder Voss raised his hand for silence, his crystalline form pulsing with barely contained agitation. "You cannot simply interfere with our systems. The quantum core is beyond even our current understanding. It was built by our ancestors. With respect." "Elder," Reyna interrupted, her voice firm but diplomatic. "Understanding can wait. Right now, we need to act. That core goes critical. It takes your entire civilization with it. We've dealt with similar crises before." "But how?" Naira asked, genuinely curious even in the face of danger. "Your technology is less advanced." Reed grinned, already pulling equipment from his pack. "Maybe. But we've had to solve problems like this under pressure countless times. When you don't have the luxury of immortality, you get very good at thinking on your feet." The next 5 hours became a lesson in human crisis management. The Phoenix, humanity's orbital support vessel, descended into atmosphere against all Zarian safety protocols. Teams of human engineers worked alongside increasingly amazed immortals, their movements quick but precise, their commands clear and decisive. Theron found himself running through the city's maintenance tunnels with Lieutenant Amara Santos, a human engineer whose short life had somehow contained more practical experience than his 1,000 years. She talked constantly as they worked, explaining each decision, each risk, each backup plan. "See, that's your problem," she said, rewiring a control node with remarkable speed. "You built this system to last forever, but nothing lasts forever. Everything needs maintenance, upgrades, the ability to adapt. Perfection isn't about being unchanging. It's about being able to change when you need to." Above them, Reed and his team had identified the core's fundamental flaw. It had been designed to maintain a perfect state indefinitely, but reality itself wasn't perfect. Tiny quantum fluctuations over millennia had created microscopic imperfections that the system couldn't correct because it had never been programmed to expect them. "Your ancestors built this to be eternal," Reed explained to the council as his team worked. "But the universe doesn't do eternal. It does entropy, change, evolution. Fighting that doesn't create perfection. It just delays the inevitable breakdown." With less than an hour remaining, the humans proposed something that shocked the Xyrians to their core: a controlled shutdown and restart of the entire system. The Immortals had never considered turning off the power source that had run continuously for 10,000 years. "Trust us," Reyna urged, her eyes meeting Naira's. "Sometimes you have to let go of what you have to create something better." In those final minutes, as the humans' plan went into action, the Immortals witnessed something that challenged their most fundamental beliefs. These short-lived beings moved with absolute confidence, their mortality giving them an understanding of risk and reward that the Xyrians had never needed to develop. The city went dark for the first time in recorded history. In that darkness, Naira felt something she hadn't experienced in centuries, her heart pounding. Around her, she heard the humans working, their voices calm and focused in the face of potential catastrophe. When the lights came back on, the quantum core hummed with new energy. Reed's team had not just prevented the collapse, they had improved the system, making it more adaptable, more resilient, more imperfect, but paradoxically stronger for it. "How did you know this would work?" Elder Voss asked, his voice heavy with both gratitude and bewilderment. "We didn't," Rayner replied simply. "We never know for sure. We just do our best with the time we have." That night, as the humans celebrated with characteristic enthusiasm, introducing many young Xyrians to the concept of an emergency party, Naira found herself standing with Theron in the observation dome again. "They saved us," he said quietly. "Not with superior technology or perfect knowledge, but with, what did Lieutenant Santos call it? Adaptability." Naira answered. "The willingness to embrace uncertainty." She paused, watching the humans below teaching some increasingly receptive immortals to dance. "Perhaps there are different kinds of perfection than the one we've pursued all these years." The crisis had done more than save their city. It had cracked the foundation of the Xyrians' worldview, showing them that their pursuit of unchanging perfection had become their greatest weakness. As she watched her people tentatively learning to move to human music, Naira realized that change had already begun. The question was no longer whether they would change, but how far that change would go. In the months following the quantum core crisis, a subtle transformation began to ripple through Xyrian society. What started as whispers in the crystalline corridors grew into open discussions that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The catalyst wasn't just the humans' presence. It was the question they had inadvertently planted in the immortal minds. What if eternal life wasn't the gift they had always believed it to be? Naira noticed it first in the younger generation. They began gathering in small groups, discussing human concepts like bucket lists and living in the moment. Some started creating art that was decidedly imperfect, music that broke from the traditional harmonies, and literature that explored uncomfortable themes. The breaking point came during a routine council session when junior scholar Kira, barely 600 years old, stood up and asked the unthinkable, "Is it possible to choose mortality?" The chamber fell into shocked silence. Elder Voss's crystalline form flickered with distress. "Why would anyone choose death over eternal life?" "Because," Kira replied, her voice trembling but determined, "I've been watching the humans. They live more in their brief spans than we have in millennia. They love deeper, create more passionately, fight harder for what matters. Their time limit doesn't restrict them, it drives them." The debate that followed split the Zirian society more deeply than any event in their recorded history. The traditionalists, led by Elder Voss, argued that embracing mortality would be a betrayal of their ancestors' achievements. The progressives, growing in number daily, countered that stagnation was the real betrayal. Theron, who had worked closely with the humans during the crisis, emerged as a leading voice for change. "We've confused existence with living," he declared during a public forum. "We've traded the richness of experience for the safety of permanence." The humans, still present as part of the cultural exchange, watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and concern. They had never intended to fundamentally challenge Zirian society, yet their mere presence had sparked a philosophical revolution. Dr. Reeb made a startling discovery during this period. Deep in the ancient archives, he found references to a procedure, one the Zirians' ancestors had created alongside the immortality process. It was a way to reverse the crystalline enhancement, to return to a mortal state. "They created a choice," he explained to a packed chamber. "Your ancestors understood something we're only now rediscovering, that immortality should be a choice, not an imperative." The revelation shook the foundations of Zirian society. The existence of the procedure suggested that their ancestors had been wiser, more nuanced in their thinking than their descendants had become. They hadn't seen mortality as a flaw to be permanently erased, but as one path among many. Kira became the first to formally request the procedure. "I want to live knowing that every moment matters," she announced. "I want to experience the urgency that drives human achievement, to know the sweetness that comes from things that cannot last forever." Her declaration inspired others. A movement began, led primarily by younger Zirians, but including some older ones who had grown weary of endless existence. They called themselves the Mortal Choice Movement, and their numbers grew daily. Elder Voss and the traditionalists fought back, arguing that choosing mortality was a form of suicide. They attempted to restrict access to the human delegation, fearing their influence. But it was too late. The idea of choice had taken root. Naira found herself in the middle of the conflict, understanding both sides but increasingly drawn to the courage of those willing to embrace change. She spent long hours discussing the implications with Reyna, who had become a close friend despite, or perhaps because of, their differences. "It's not about dying," Reyna explained during one such conversation. "It's about truly living. When you know something can't last forever, you appreciate it more. You fight harder to protect it. You love it more deeply." The tension reached its peak when a group of 50 Zirians, led by Kira and Theron, formally announced their intention to undergo the mortality procedure. The council chamber erupted into chaos as they made their declaration. "You would throw away the greatest gift our species has achieved?" Elder Voss demanded. "No," Theron replied calmly. "We would embrace the gift of choice our ancestors actually intended for us. The gift of being able to decide what kind of life we want to live." As the debate raged, Naira noticed something extraordinary. The Zirians who had chosen mortality were already changing. There was an intensity to them, a fire in their eyes that reminded her of the humans. They moved differently, spoke differently, lived differently, even before the procedure. The choice itself had awakened something in them. Standing in the council chamber, watching her society grapple with this fundamental challenge to their way of life, Naira finally understood what the humans had been trying to teach them. Perfection wasn't about achieving an unchanging state. It was about having the courage to change, to grow, to risk. The real question wasn't whether to live forever or to embrace mortality. The real question was whether to remain trapped in the prison of certainty or to step into the unknown wilderness of possibility. And as she watched more of her people choose the latter, she realized that humanity hadn't proved their immortality wrong. They had proved that immortality itself wasn't the point. The true measure of life was not its length, but its depth. The day of the first transformation was marked by a silence, different from the usual quiet of Zeria Prime. This silence held anticipation, fear, and an electric sense of possibility that had been absent from their world for millennia. 50 Zerians, including Kira and Theron, prepared to undergo the procedure that would strip away their immortality. The ancient chamber deep beneath the city had been readied under Dr. Reed's guidance, its crystalline walls humming with energy that would reverse what their ancestors had done so long ago. The procedure room glowed with a soft blue light, making the gathered Zerians' crystalline forms shimmer like stars about to fade. "Are you certain?" Naira asked Theron one final time, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of friendship. He smiled, and for the first time, she saw something new in his expression: urgency, excitement, fear, all mixed together in a way that seemed suddenly, startlingly alive. "I've never been more certain of anything in my 1,000 years." The human medical team worked alongside Zerian scientists, monitoring a process that would remove the biocrystalline structures from their bodies. Captain Reyna stood witness, her presence a reminder of why they had chosen this path. "The process will take approximately 6 hours, Dr. Reed explained. "You'll feel everything changing. Your senses, your perception of time, your very consciousness will shift. Are you ready?" Kira stepped forward first, her voice steady. "We're ready to truly live." The procedure began, the chamber filled with a resonance that seemed to pierce through the very essence of what made the Zerians immortal. Those watching saw the impossible. The crystalline aspects of the volunteers' bodies began to fade, revealing something more organic, more vulnerable, and somehow more vibrant beneath. Hours passed. The immortals watched in fascination as their brethren changed. Color flooded into formerly metallic skin. Hearts began to beat with new urgency. Eyes that had seen millennia pass with detachment suddenly brimmed with tears, the first tears shed on Zeria Prime in countless generations. When it was done, Theron stood on shaking legs, experiencing fatigue for the first time in his existence. He touched his face, feeling warm skin instead of cool crystal. "Everything feels more," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "The air, the light, my own heartbeat. It's all so intense." The transformed Zerians began to experience sensations they had forgotten or never known. Hunger, thirst, the need to rest. But with these mortal demands came something else, a heightened awareness of every moment, a new appreciation for the simple act of breathing. The impact on Zerian society was immediate and profound. The newly mortal Zerians approached everything with an intensity that both frightened and fascinated their immortal brethren. They began creating art that moved viewers to tears, music that made hearts race, and poetry that spoke of both the beauty and terror of finite existence. Months passed, and the transformed Zerians aged, subtly at first, then more noticeably. Each line that appeared on their faces, each gray hair that emerged, became a badge of pride. They were living proof that mortality was not a weakness, but a different kind of strength. More Zerians came forward, requesting the transformation. The movement grew, not in a rush, but in a steady stream that suggested deep contemplation rather than impulsive decision. Each new group brought their own reasons for choosing mortality. Elder Voss, who had opposed the change so vigorously, found himself spending time with the transformed ones, particularly Kira. He watched as she lived each day with purpose and passion, and slowly his resistance began to crack. The humans prepared to leave Zeria Prime, their mission having evolved far beyond what anyone had imagined. They had come to learn from an immortal civilization, and instead had helped them rediscover their mortality, and with it, their humanity. On their last night, Reyna stood with Naira in the observation dome, watching both moons rise over the crystalline city. "You know," she said softly, "when we first arrived, we thought we'd find beings who had achieved perfection. Instead, we found people who had forgotten how to live. Now you're remembering. Some through choosing mortality, others through simply questioning what they thought they knew about life and death." Raina smiled. "That's the real gift of being mortal. Not the certainty of death, but the ability to keep growing, keep changing, keep discovering who you are." As the human delegation prepared to depart, they left behind a transformed world. Zuria Prime was no longer a perfect, unchanging monument to immortality. It had become something far more beautiful, a place where each being could choose their own path, where the value of life was measured not in years but in moments fully lived. The Immortals had learned that their undying nature wasn't wrong. It was simply one option among many. True perfection lay not in achieving an unchanging state, but in having the wisdom to choose one's own path and the courage to walk it fully. In the end, humanity hadn't proved their immortality wrong. They had proved that the choice to live, truly live, whether for a day or forever, was the greatest power of all. And in the centuries that followed, as mortal and immortal Zirians lived side by side, their civilization flourished in ways it never had before. They had found something greater than eternal life. They had found eternal growth, eternal change, eternal possibility. The perfect crystalline spires still reached for the stars, but now they cast shadows on gardens where mortal children played, their laughter echoing through halls that had known only silence for millennia. It was not the end of their civilization, as some had feared, but a new beginning. And in the Grand Archive, where the story of their transformation was recorded, the first lines read, "We thought we had achieved perfection through immortality, until humanity showed us that perfection lies in the courage to change."